Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
The true culture of any company is not like the slogan that you have on the wall or the exercise you did at the retreat one time. The true culture of any company is the shared habits of that group. If it's not a habit, it's not actually part of your culture.
welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 369 with James Clear. James is an author and speaker focused on habits, decision-making, and continuous improvement. A freak baseball accident put James in a desperate place, fighting to recover from brain damage. The debilitating brain injury forced him to discover a new way of living. Recovery took James to a new understanding of habits and the power of stacking simple, easy habits, one on top of the other, to create momentum and change. His book, Atomic Habits, Tiny Changes, Remarkable Results, shares his learnings with the world. It has sold well over 1 million copies and has been translated into numerous languages. He is a regular speaker at Fortune 500 companies, and his work is used by teams in the NFL, NBA, and MLB. We covered numerous topics in this conversation, including, as you might expect, 1. How to build good habits and break bad ones. 2. Why systems are much more important than goals alone. And 3. What kind of meta habits deliver a massive return in life. We explore this and a whole lot more, so strap yourself in for an hour with Mr. Atomic Habits himself, James Clear. Welcome to the show, James.
Hi, good to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. You're joining me from, you back home in Columbus, Ohio at the moment?
That's right, Columbus, Ohio.
Fantastic. Well, one of Ohio's favorite sons would have to be LeBron James, and I know he's no stranger when it comes to habit formation. He sleeps something like 12 hours a day. He drinks a ton of water. He invests quality time with his family. But for so many people, creating these good habits and incorporating them into our lives can be somewhat difficult. Why is that?
Yeah. LeBron's an interesting case study. I think I've heard that he spends $1 million a year on his body and training, so he's invested in it incredibly heavily. Obviously, the average person doesn't have those kind of resources to allocate, and so I think it mostly comes down to strategy. And that question about why is it so hard to build a good habit is an interesting one, because the inverse is often so easy, right? It's often so easy to build a bad habit. And so obviously I wrote a book on the subject, and when I was working on Atomic Habits, one of the questions that I asked a lot was, why is it so easy to build bad habits? What can we learn about building good ones by looking at why certain behaviors form so readily? And roughly speaking, it comes down to about 4 things. And you don't need all 4 of these things to work if you want to build a habit, but the more of them that you have working for you, the easier the process is going to be. So the first thing that you want, if you want to build a good habit, is you want your habits to be obvious. So like you want the cues and things that prompt the habit to be available, visible, easy to see. The second thing that you want is you want the habit to be attractive. You can sort of think about each habit as having kind of like a certain amount of energy that you need to put into it to get it to stick. Like a habit of doing 100 push-ups a day might be successful or great if you could do it, but it requires a lot of energy, whereas the habit of doing 1 push-up a day is much more attractive on the days where you feel exhausted and so on. And that leads into the third thing that you want, which is you want your habits to be easy. The easier, convenient, more frictionless a habit is, the more likely it is to stick. And the fourth and final thing is you want your habits to be satisfying. And what you find is that not every behavior in life is rewarding, right? Sometimes things have a consequence, sometimes they're fairly neutral, but it's hard for a behavior to become a habit if it's not rewarding.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of your bad habits that form, like say eating a donut or smoking a cigarette, you'll find that they often check quite a few of those boxes. Like eating a donut is, in many cases, it's obvious because you can't drive down the street without passing a pastry shop or a bakery, or you walk into the community cafeteria or the break room at work, and people have donuts and snacks and muffins and stuff laying out. So it's around you. It's very attractive because you know that it tastes good. It's easy enough. All you have to do is pick it up. And then, of course, it's satisfying because when you take a bite, it is, in fact, sweet, sugary, tasty, enjoyable, and so on. And I think this is a really meaningful way to distinguish what is a good habit and what is a bad habit, is that behaviors sort of produce multiple outcomes across time. So your good habits, the immediate outcome is often unfavorable. Going to the gym is hard at first or requires effort. You don't see much change in your body for the first week. It's only a month or 6 or a year later that you get the benefit that you want. But with bad habits, the immediate outcome is often really favorable. The immediate outcome of eating a donut is great. It's only the ultimate outcome that's unfavorable. So roughly speaking, those 4 things: make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. And I think if people don't build habits, they often don't have those 4 things working in their favor.
Yeah. And how much does that come back to, say, our biological predispositions to essentially conserve energy? A number of psychologists have talked about this evolutionary theory whereby our brains evolved to conserve energy because when we were running around the African savanna, that helped us to survive. So nowadays, we still have that predisposition. So it's sitting down at our desk, for example, in the morning to conserve energy. Well, let's just check email and respond to some emails. Let's just jump onto LinkedIn because it's easy. How much does that have to do with habit formation?
Yeah, so I think that is probably one of our best explanations for like what is a habit, why do we have it to begin with? Like if we walk this all the way back to first principles, you can say, okay, what is life? Well, life is the amount of time that an organism has energy. Once you run out of energy, you cease to exist, you die. And that is true not just for humans, of course, but for any living organism. And so energy is perhaps our most precious resource. Once you run out of it, you no longer have time, you no longer are alive. And so whenever possible, any organism is going to prioritize methods that make it easier to either conserve energy or get energy. And you can imagine, for example, just a rudimentary example, like let's say it's 100,000 years ago and your ancestors walking around the savannah, and you either could forage for berries in the bush that is 10 meters away, or you could walk to the other side of the mountain and forage for berries over there. Well, nobody's going to do the second option because it would waste energy. It would waste time, and energy is precious. And so we start looking for the path of least resistance. We start looking for the path that's most effective, the path that is most energy saving. And in fact, there's a principle in physics that comes back to this, which they call the law of least effort. And basically, the path that requires the least amount of effort or the least amount of energy to be used is almost always the one that gets used. And this is true not just for even organisms, but even for like if you throw a ball on a parabolic arc, it'll follow the path of least effort, the law of least effort. So the point here is that conserving energy is crucial. And so throughout evolution, the body and brain have come up with methods for doing that. And habits are one of our best strategies for doing so, because once you identify a method that is effective, the brain starts to automate that process so that you don't have to allocate attention to it anymore. And an organism that can do something on autopilot, like pick berries out of a bush. Imagine the very first time you pick a berry off a bush, you're like 2 years old or something. And maybe you need like to think carefully about the dexterity of your fingers and like what you're pulling and how hard you need to pull to get it to detach from the branch. And like all these other characteristics that once you've done this 1,000 times, you're not thinking about it at all. You can chat with the person next to you and keep pulling berries off the bush all day. You can think about whatever the next thing is that you need to do. And so whenever the brain can automate things like that, then you could pull berries off the bush automatically while scanning the savannah and using your attention to check, oh, is there a predator on the horizon, or is a storm coming and I need to take shelter, and so on. And so that, I think, gets us to a summary of what a habit is, which is habits allow you to solve the problems of life with less energy or effort than you would otherwise. So there's sort of like these mental shortcuts that you can use to solve the problems that recur in your environment again and again. Now, for our ancestors, that was something like taking shelter or finding food. But in modern society, it's things like getting my work done, or browsing, finishing off email, or making the bed in the morning, or preparing the next meal in the kitchen. And if you look around, your life is filled with habits and behaviors. Depending on what research study you look at, the estimate is somewhere between 40 to 50% of your daily behaviors are automatic and habitual. But I think the true influence of them is even much greater than that, because often the automatic mental shortcuts that you follow determine what you do with the next chunk of time. Like, you might stand in line at the grocery store and just habitually pull your phone out of your pocket. Well, that action was habitual, but maybe answering email or playing a video game or reading an article or browsing social media, whatever you do next, that might be careful and effortful and thoughtful, but it was shaped by that habit that came before it. So the true influence of your habits, the amount of behaviors that are affected or impacted by your habits, might be much greater, 80, 90%, who knows? But they play a very significant role because they allow you to solve the problems of life with less energy than you needed otherwise.
Yeah, so that means that we can then, if we have awareness of that fact, we can use that to our advantage when it comes to building habits. So you mentioned this concept from physics, the path of least effort. Now, you mentioned earlier push-ups. So if I take the path of least effort, which is let's just do 5 push-ups instead of 100 push-ups, that also ties in with Isaac Newton's laws of motion. An object in motion stays in motion. If I do those 5 push-ups, it's much easier to do another 5 push-ups or another 20 push-ups than it is if I don't do that first push-up to begin with. And I guess you can apply that to reading a book. I find some nights I just don't want to read, but hey, I'll pick up the book, I'll commit to reading that one page. After I've done that one page, it's so much easier to turn the page and finish the rest of the chapter.
Yeah, you do see this a lot. Obviously, there's probably a physicist out there cringing at us taking these examples, like applying them to daily life like this. But I think from a philosophy standpoint, right? As a general approach, I think there's some soundness to it. There's another one that references just what you were talking about here, the coefficient of friction. So, like, if you have a box sitting on a table, the most friction it experiences is when it's static, when it's at rest. Once you start to push it and it starts to slide across the table, it actually slides a little easier. So you got to put the most effort in at the very beginning. That's exactly what you're saying, right? You got to put the hardest part is actually reading the first page, not the 10th page. Once you've already read 9 and you're in the middle of the story, that's much easier. The hardest part is doing the first push-up, not the 8th push-up, because now you've already got a little bit of momentum going. You're already into the work. There's a quote that I love from Ed Lattimore where he says the heaviest weight of the gym is the front door. And I think that summarizes this whole idea, right? That often it's starting your habits that is the biggest challenge. And in fact, you could even look at being consistent with a habit, doing something every day for a year or every day for 10 years even. Actually, all that is really is consistency is just getting started over and over again. And so if you can figure out how to make your habits easy to start each day, then it becomes much easier to be consistent with them. And there's a method or a little exercise or strategy that I refer to in the book. I call it the 2-minute rule. And it basically says, take whatever habit you're trying to build and you scale it down to something that takes 2 minutes or less to do. So, your reading example, read 30 books a year becomes read 1 page, or running. If you want to run a half marathon or run 4 days a week, that becomes put on my running shoes. And sometimes I tell people that and they resist a little bit because they're like, all right, I know the real goal is to actually go for a run. I'm not just trying to put my shoes on. But I had a reader, his name's Mitch. I mentioned him in the book. He ended up losing a lot of weight, 40, 50 kilos, about 100 pounds. And the first 6 weeks that he went to the gym, he had a little rule for himself where he wasn't allowed to stay for longer than 5 minutes. So he would get in the car, drive to the gym, get out, do half an exercise, get back in the car, drive home. And it sounds ridiculous, right? You're like, okay, clearly this is not going to get this guy in shape. But what you realize is that he was mastering the art of showing up. He was becoming the type of person that went to the gym 4 days a week, even if it was only for 5 minutes. And I think that's actually a much deeper truth about habits and kind of gets at the central point of your question there, which is a habit must be established before it can be improved. Like you have to make it the standard in your life before you can optimize and scale it up. And so often we're focused on finding like the perfect workout program, the best business idea, the ideal diet plan. We're so focused on optimizing that we don't give ourselves permission to show up, even if it's just in a small way. And so all of this scaling it down and making it easy and following the 2-minute rule, like those are all strategies to make it easy to start so that you actually have something to optimize. You have something to improve and scale up once you've built a habit out of it.
Yeah. And we see this in the business world as well, where you have one school of thought, which is let's just build something and learn from the feedback that we get. And that process of actually being in the game is far more likely to give you the learnings you need to get to your goal versus people who over pontificate and deliberate about what they should do and never actually get off the starting block in some way. But one thing you touched on there was when people come up with a goal of, say, reading 30 books a year. Now, it's no secret that New Year's resolutions, something like 90% of them, I think, are busted by February, I think the stat is. Now, in your book, you talk about the 3 layers of behavioral change. 1 being changing your outcomes, which is associated with those goals. 2 being changing your process, which is all about systems. And the 3rd being about changing your identity, which is all about beliefs and self-image. Now, why are goals flawed, and what should we be doing instead of just defining those goals?
Yeah, I think the way you phrase it there is good. Instead of just doing that, before I criticize goals too much, I want to say like, this is coming from someone who's very goal oriented, right? Like I would set goals for the grades I wanted in school or the weight I wanted to lift in the gym, for how much revenue I wanted my business to earn. But at some point I realized that setting those goals, like sometimes I would achieve them and sometimes I wouldn't. It was like, okay, well, clearly setting the goal is not the thing that determines that then. And I think that's kind of the role goals play. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient for success. And in fact, what did make the biggest difference was the system or the process that I was following. And the way that I would describe this is that you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So often we think success is about be more ambitious, set a bigger goal, have a bigger vision, 10x your output. And that stuff sounds great, but the truth is that what actually drives results is not the goal. Having a goal is the easy part. Like I could set a goal right now to sell 10 million books. It took me like 3 seconds. And in fact, when you look at the winners and the losers, so to speak, in any given field, what you find is that they often have the same goals. If you have 30 teams competing in a league, presumably they all have the goal of winning the championship. Right? It's not the goal that separates them. Or if you have 100 candidates who apply for a job, every candidate has the goal of getting the job. It's not the goal that determines the difference. It's the system, the process, the way they prepare, the collection of daily habits that got them there. And that's how I would define the difference here. Your goal is your desired outcome. Your system is the collection of daily habits that you have. And if there is ever a gap between your desired outcome and your daily habits, if there's ever a gap between your goal and your system, the system will always win. In fact, like your current habits, your current system is perfectly designed by definition for your current results. And so if you want the results to change, then the thing that needs to shift is actually the system that precedes the results, the habits that come before that. And actually, I could probably even put a finer point on it and say your habits 6 months ago or something like that were perfectly designed for your current results. And in most areas of life, your outcomes are a lagging measure of your habits. Like your knowledge is a lagging measure of your reading and learning habits. Your physical fitness is a lagging measure of your eating and training habits. Your bank account is a lagging measure of your financial habits. Even your like clutter in your desk or your office or your bedroom is a lagging measure of your cleaning habits. And so you often get what you repeat, basically, is what I'm saying. And so the focus here should not be on the goal as much as it should be on the system that precedes the goal.
Yeah. And this is something that I've had several championship winning coaches of various sports on the show in the past. And one question I often pose is, after they've won the championship, how do you rally the team to come back the next year? Because oftentimes success breeds complacency. And they say, look, we just focus on the process rather than the goal. We've got our systems in place, and you know what? Luck does play a role. Sometimes you can have the right process and have a positive outcome or a negative outcome, but over the long term, it tends to get you a lot closer to that objective than if you don't have those systems in place, or if the systems are a bit scrappy to begin with.
Right. This is like the famous quote from Bill Walsh, who won 3 Super Bowls as a coach, where he just says, the score takes care of itself. Right. Like if we for any team, the goal is to have the best score on the scoreboard at the end of the game. But if you spent all game looking at the scoreboard, you would always lose. And if you spent none of the game looking at the scoreboard and just focused on executing your process and your system appropriately, you would probably win quite a few. And so the score takes care of itself if the system is running properly.
Yeah, makes sense. So with the 4 laws of behavior change that you introduced earlier, make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. I mean, these are essentially about helping us to create systems to get us closer to our goals. Now, with making it obvious, from what I understand, this is all about, environment design or associated with environment design. So, for example, one example I often talk about on the show is, if I don't want to eat that pack of Doritos at 10 p.m. at night when I'm sitting on the couch and watching Netflix, well, it's much easier if the pack of Doritos isn't even in the house, and that I need to create this friction whereby if I want these Doritos, I've got to get in my car and drive down to the grocery store, and I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to eat a carrot or not eat anything at all. So how important is environment design when it comes to building these better habits to get us closer to our goals?
Yeah, what you find is, in the short run, your willpower might be able to beat your environment, but in the long run, it almost never wins. Yeah. And so you can resist the temptations of your environment for an hour or a day or maybe a week, but month after month, year after year, we start to become a product of the spaces and the people that we surround ourselves with. And so optimizing your environment to make the good habits obvious and the bad habits invisible, to make the good habits easy and the bad habits difficult, is one of the most powerful ways to change your behavior without having to change your motivation, without having to change your willpower. The example you gave is a good one, keeping food out of the house, but there are a bunch of examples of that. If you spend too much money on electronics, don't read the latest tech review blogs. You're always being prompted to buy the next gadget. If you are trying to go on a diet, don't follow a bunch of baking and cooking accounts on Instagram. You're constantly being tempted or reminded of what you're trying to avoid. If you don't want to spend as much money on Amazon, then unsubscribe from the emails from Nordstrom or your favorite stores or whatever they are. And so those examples are ways of reducing exposure to the cue that prompts that bad habit. And the more that you can do that, the more effective, or easier, I should say, you'll find it is to resist that. Now, you also mentioned increasing friction, like having to drive down the road to get the Doritos or whatever. You can do the same kind of thing in a variety of ways. Often it's helpful to use technology to increase friction. So, for example, if you do have snacks in the house, and you're fine with eating them at, say, a different time of the day, but you find that, also I do late night snacking or whatever. There's a little device called a kitchen safe. And it's like a piece of Tupperware, a plastic container that you can put the food in, and then it's programmable on the top, and it'll automatically lock it until a set time. Yep. So, for example, I have one guy who read Atomic Habits, and he liked eating some of the things he had, but just didn't want to eat any of them after dinner each night. And so as soon as dinner ended, he put the snacks in the kitchen safe, programmed it for 7 a.m. the next day, and then it was locked all the way through the night until he went to bed and then woke up and he didn't have to worry about it. And so that's one way of increasing the friction of the task. And you can do that in a variety of different ways. I have a bunch of examples in the book, but the concept, the core, the key insight is the same, which is you want to increase the number of steps between you and the bad behaviors and reduce the number of steps between you and the good ones. And, as another example, take like watching television. A lot of people feel like they watch too much TV, or maybe they like watching it, but they just get this sense that I'm doing this a little bit more than would be good, or a little bit more than is productive. I'm kind of wasting a lot of time. And but if you walk into pretty much any living room, where do all the couches and chairs face? Right? It's like, what is this room designed to get you to do? And it's the most obvious, frictionless, convenient choice in that space. And I'm not saying you have to rearrange your entire house, but there's a spectrum of choices. You could like take a chair and turn it away from the TV, have it face a coffee table with a book on it. You could put the remote control inside a drawer so that it's out of sight, put a book in its place. You could put the TV itself inside a wall unit or a cabinet so that it's behind doors and you're less likely to see it. It's like closed off until you intentionally open it up. You could unplug the TV after each use and then only plug it back in if you can say the name of the show that you want to watch. So you can't just like mindlessly turn it on and find something. Now, no single choice, no single environment design change is going to radically transform your behavior. But imagine the effect of living or working in a place that has a dozen or 24 or 50 little choices like that, all nudging and pushing you toward the right direction. It suddenly becomes a situation where you're not fighting your environment anymore. You're like working with it. And it's much easier to make the right choice when the good habit is the path of least resistance.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And one of my goals, if you will, over the last 12 months was to spend less time on my phone. And my average has come down from about 3 hours down to about 40 minutes a day nowadays. And one simple thing was to just remove email from my phone and remove social media apps from my phone. I mean, I can still check them, but it means opening the browser and having to enter my username and password. And that's just too much. More often than not, I'm like, oh, screw it. I'll just do something else. And it's also that layer of friction also reminds me as to why I did that to begin with. Whereas if the app was already there, authenticated, I just click the button and I'm in, it's a totally different story.
It's remarkable how little friction is needed sometimes for a bad habit to like fade away. Similar to your example there, I have this little rule. I probably do it 90% of days where I leave my phone in another room until lunch. And so that gives me a block of time from, 8 to noon or so where I can just focus and work on the most important task rather than responding to everybody else's agenda. Or, honestly, I'm like everybody else. If I have my phone right next to me, I'll check it every 3 minutes just because it's there.
Yeah.
But I work in a home office. And so if I leave it in another room, it's only, I just got to go down the stairs. It's only like 30 seconds away, but I never go get it. And so I'm like, well, did I want it or not? Like in the one hand, I wanted it bad enough to check it every 3 minutes when it was next to me. But on the other hand, I never wanted it bad enough to walk 30 seconds to get it.
Yeah.
And technology does that for so many of our habits now. They're so convenient, so frictionless, so obvious and easy that we find ourselves acting on them, clicking these apps, ordering things, browsing stuff, just when we have like the slightest whim of a desire, the faintest hint of a boredom. And if you can just increase the friction a little bit, then you'll find that actually I didn't really want it that bad. Like your example of not logging into social media. It's like, well, actually I didn't want to check Instagram that bad. I just was bored and wanted to check it like if it was easy. But if it takes 30 seconds to log in, I don't care that much.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing of being able to use friction to curtail habits to the desired degree just by increasing the amount of steps between you and the action.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. One of the other laws is all about making it attractive, James. And one thing you talk about in the book is this concept of habit stacking, which I guess if I'm a huge fan of listening to, say, the Joe Rogan podcast, but I hate running on a treadmill, well, I could combine those two and listen to that podcast while running on the treadmill and make that somewhat more pleasant. Essentially, I'm combining something that I need to do with something that I want to do.
Right. So the whole idea here is you're trying to like reframe how you're viewing this habit in your mind. Right now you might only associate it with pain or struggle or effort, or maybe it's a benefit, but the benefit's so delayed that it's like, I'm not going to see the payoff for 2 weeks or 2 months or a year. So I need a reason to show up right now. And one of the researchers who was behind this, her name is Katie Milkman, and she referred to it as temptation bundling, because basically what you're going to do is you're going to bundle this thing you like to do with, as you said, the thing you want to do. And, the thing you want to do with the thing you need to do, the thing you like to do with the thing you need to do. So her example was she liked reading the Hunger Games trilogy when it came out. This is around the time she came up with this idea, and she knew she needed to work out more. And so she was like, well, I'll set this rule for myself where I can only read the Hunger Games when I'm running on the treadmill at the gym. Or I've heard from other people who They're terrible at processing their emails. They hate doing it. It's a hassle. It's annoying. They always have these overdue work emails. But this lady wanted to get a pedicure and she liked getting them each week. And so she made a rule where I can only get a pedicure if I'm processing overdue work emails at the same time. And so that's the same kind of idea. Maybe you've got a podcast that you really love, but you're like, I'm eating out too often and I'd be much healthier if I cooked more meals. Well, I'm only allowed to listen to that podcast while I'm cooking a healthy meal at home. And so by starting to pair these things you really enjoy doing with the habits that you need to do, you provide a little bit of immediate enjoyment, like the long-term output or the long-term result of cooking meals, like healthy meals at home, for example. After any individual meal, your body looks the same. The scale hasn't really changed. Like you don't have any visual evidence that this was worth it. Mm-hmm. It's only cooking for yourself or eating healthier is only worth it a year or 2 or 5 later, right? You see these effects in a very long time span. But getting the benefit of listening to your favorite podcast, well, that's something you can experience right now. And so you have this immediate reward to kind of bridge that valley of death. And get you through that gap early on so that you've got an immediate reason to show up and you're still getting the long-term benefits of the habit that you want to build. And that strategy that you mentioned, pairing those two together can be a very effective way to do that.
Yeah, and what you just mentioned there about the reward, I know there's it was a paper by Edwin Locke several decades ago on motivation and short feedback loops, and that we get the feedback from performing an action, and that feedback could be positive or negative, but it gives us some direction around what we should do next, and that can be motivating. And I mean, oftentimes in the corporate world, people are incredibly unmotivated because the time between action and result can be months, if not years in some cases. So what you've talked about there is, hey, if I'm eating well, it could be 6 months, a year, 2 years before I really start to see results. I start to see abs or a smaller waistline or whatever it is. But by stacking that thing I need to do with the thing I want to do, I have essentially something that acts as a surrogate for that short feedback loop, which is the reward I get from watching my favorite show or listening to my favorite podcast or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. Surrogate reward. That's a good way to phrase it. And the feedback loop thing is crucial. Seth Godin has a great quote that I think summarizes it well, which is just the best way to change long-term behaviors with short-term feedback. Mm-hmm. And, long term, there are all kinds of things that we think would be beneficial for our future selves in a year or 5 years or 10 years. And we see how habits can add up to that. But having a short term feedback loop that reinforces that or that gives you an immediate reason to stick to the behavior is really crucial. In fact, I think this is perhaps so strong, the effect of this, that in Atomic Habits, I refer to it as the cardinal rule of behavior change, which is behaviors that are immediately rewarded get repeated. Behaviors that are immediately punished get avoided. And it's really about the speed of that reward or consequence that determines whether you want to stick with something or whether you want to avoid it. Things that make you feel good in the moment, you have every reason in the world to stick with it because it's pleasurable and enjoyable. But if you got to wait too long for the gratification, it's hard to stick with it. So yeah, the short-term feedback is a crucial part.
Yeah. And I mean, what you mentioned there about Seth Godin creating these shorter term rewards, it aligns with something that Scott Belsky, he was the founder of Behance, and he sold that company for something like $300 million after building it up for 10 years, an online design company. And one thing he said was in the early days, we weren't really making a lot of money. And so what we needed to do instead was create all of these sort of faux rewards. Like instead of looking at revenue as the metric that defines our success, it was more about, well, are we getting more people signing up to our free trial, and just creating all these other little rewards that the team could celebrate and use as a guide, essentially, that was showing them that they were going in the right direction. Whereas if they just looked at revenue alone, they probably would have been immensely unmotivated.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think this is an important concept, which we could broaden this a little bit and take it from feedback and talk about measurement in general.
Sure.
Measurement can be really powerful for getting habits to stick, but it can also be demotivating if you choose the wrong measure. And I think one way to consider this, or to try to hone in on what is the right measure for me and for the habits I'm trying to build, is you want a pace of measurement that matches the frequency of the habit that you need to stick to. So, for example, if you're trying to take, like my dad. So my dad likes to swim, But whenever he goes to the pool and jumps in, he does the workout and he gets out and his body looks exactly the same, right, as it did when he got in the water. So there's no physical change, even though he's hoping for that if he sticks to the workout. Mm-hmm. And if he goes and steps on the scale hasn't really changed either. But how many people use the scale as the measurement for whether the workout is effective or not, right? It's like the most common way to measure that. Yeah. But the problem is you need to work out at a frequency of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 times a week. And the scale may only change once in a meaningful way every 2 weeks, but like it takes a while. And so the pace of the measurement and the pace of the habit are very different. And it's easy to do the habit 3 or 4 times, step on the scale, and you've actually gained a pound. And you're like, oh, this isn't even worth it. And it's because the measurement and the habit are not aligned well. Versus what my dad does, which is when he gets out of the pool, he pulls out this little pocket calendar that he has and he puts an X on that day. And this is just a basic form of a habit tracker. But that little X, no, his body hasn't transformed, but it gives him a little bit of immediate feedback. It gives him a signal, that a visual cue that, hey, you showed up, you did the right thing. You are building up this streak of workouts you haven't missed in 3 weeks or whatever it is. And that can be motivating to have a signal of feedback, a signal of measurement that matches the pace of the habit. And so I think whether we're talking about lifting or any other area of business, whatever it is, Belsky's example is a good one for the business context, which is we need to show up to work each day and keep like trying to make headway on our big strategic vision. But if we make this feedback about the revenue, well, that's actually not going to come for 3 months or 6 months or maybe even longer. And so we got to find a different form of measurement, signups, email subscribers, free trial, whatever it is, to verify that we're making progress and moving in the right direction.
Definitely. So the fourth law, essentially, of behavioral change, James, is all about making it satisfying. And one thing you talk about in the book is the Goldilocks Zone. And I guess that kind of aligns with what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi talked about with getting into the flow state, which is doing stuff that's about, what do they say, 4% more difficult than your current capability. So it stretches you, but it's not too difficult. And again, it's not easy. And whenever I think about this, I think of the iconic photo of Michael Jordan standing over Muggsy Bogues and just holding the ball up. It just looks like it's just too easy for Jordan on that day. Although people who know how that went down know that Muggsy actually stole the ball from Jordan. So that's how that went down. But nonetheless, what can you tell us about the Goldilocks Zone and why this is so important to actually making habit formation satisfying for people?
Yeah. So the Goldilocks Zone says that the Goldilocks rule for motivation says that humans experience peak levels of motivation when they work on a task of just manageable difficulty. Not too hard, not too easy, just right. And as you said, some researchers have tried to quantify this, and they came up with 4% as the amount of effort beyond your current abilities. Now, of course, in real life, it's hard to quantify what exactly is 4% better as a writer or as a spouse, or you might be able to do it in the gym and calculate 4% more weight, but most areas of life resist that. But I think as a philosophy, this idea of you want to stretch just a little bit. One way I like to explain it is imagine you're playing tennis. So if you play against Roger Federer, Serena Williams, somebody who's the best in the world, it might be cool for a minute, but it's going to get boring pretty quickly because they're going to win every point. You play against a 3-year-old, might be cute for a minute, but if you're trying to have a serious match, that's going to get boring because you're going to win every point. But if you play against somebody who's like roughly your equal, they win a few points, you win a few points, you have a chance to win, but only if you really try. That's kind of where we're getting this like peak level of motivation. You're like stretched. It's not just easy. You need to like actually apply yourself, but that's very motivating because you have a chance to succeed. And you know that you need to be fully engaged. This is when you get into that flow state that you mentioned and so on. And in the case of habits, a question that often arises is, there's this challenge really, which is that the process of mastery requires you to repeat something again and again in order to master it. And the more that you do that, the more habitual, the more automatic, the more fluent you become in that skill, whatever that thing is, the more expected the outcome becomes because you have done this 100 times or 1,000 times before. You know what's going to happen next. And when the outcomes are expected, when the process is standard, it no longer has like novelty and starts to get boring because it's not surprising anymore. And you see people do this a lot with their habits. They do something, it might even still be working, but they give up on it because it's not new or interesting or novel anymore. It's starting to get a little bit boring. I had a buddy that I trained with in the gym. He was very strong, and he was doing this squat program, and it was working great for him. He was making progress on a squat every week, every month. He was probably doing it for 2 or 3 months. And then I left. I had to travel. I was on break for a little while. I came back like a month or two later, and he wasn't doing the squat program anymore. I was like, hey, how's it going? How's training been? He's like, kind of okay. I was like, well, you're still doing that program that worked well? I was like, no. I was like, well, why did you stop? Did you get hurt or something? He was like, no. And I was like, did it stop working? No. He just got bored with it. And it was actually getting results, and yet still he ditched it. And Machiavelli has a quote that I think summarizes it well, where he says, like, men desire novelty to such a degree that those who are doing well want it just as badly as those who are doing poorly. And so a lot of the process of mastery is figuring out how to stay committed to the habits that are working and that will pay off in the long run, even once they become expected, even once it gets a little boring. And so in the book, I refer to this as like the process of falling in love with boredom. And there are a couple ways you can do that. Like, on the one hand, you can fall in love with the process. You can focus on the fact that you're mastering the art of showing up. You can think less about the act itself and more about, less about the result itself and more about the practice of becoming a craftsman and becoming a master and so on. But the second way that you can do it is utilize this Goldilocks rule idea to try to find some small way to stretch, some small area. And it doesn't even have to be the whole process. A good example, I think, for me recently. So sometimes when I train in the gym, I'll do front squats, which is where you put the bar on the front of your shoulders. Well, my dad recently told me that there's a cue that you can use, which is when you're in the middle of a front squat, if you push your elbows out, it will naturally straighten your upper back and help keep you in a more upright position. And so the next time I went to the gym, I'm doing this exercise that I've done 100 or 1,000 times before, and it would be boring if I did it the same way that I always did. But now I can think about keeping my elbows out, and that's some small improvement. I don't know if we would say it's 4% better exactly or not, but it gives you some little area. This gives you an idea of what that means. What does it mean to try to push a little bit or to focus on a slightly new area or to advance to a small degree? And that, I think, is a way to make that process of doing the same thing a little more novel and interesting than it would otherwise be. It's like a way to fall in love with the boredom of doing the work and continuing to master that same habit that'll work for you in the long run.
Yeah, and thanks for the tip. I'm definitely going to try that next time I'm in the gym. But with respect to making things progressively more difficult, an example I can point to is, learning to surf. So that's something that I only picked up about a year ago. And initially, just the idea of catching broken waves, whitewater, exciting. You get up on the wave, it takes you out. But then after a few weeks of doing that, that gets really easy and really boring. So then it becomes a matter of, well, what's the next level? Then it's about catching small 2-foot high green water waves, unbroken waves, and then progressively getting better or progressively chasing bigger and bigger waves, right? Otherwise, if you just do the same thing day after day after day, of course it gets boring. And we see this with a lot of people, like you said, in the gym, who start a program and then they essentially plateau, both physically because they just keep doing the same thing, but they also stop doing it altogether because it just gets boring and they're not changing it up. And it doesn't need to be a huge change either. Like you said, whether it's 4% or 2% or 6%, very small changes can have a dramatic impact on your motivation.
Right. That's a great example. And you can just see that so well visually, the idea of waves getting slightly bigger. It's just, you're just continually upgrading to the next level.
So, we've talked a lot about building good habits, and essentially breaking bad habits is the inverse of those 4 laws, right? So making things rather than obvious, making them invisible, making them unattractive, making them difficult, and making them unsatisfying. And I had Tom Zig Ziglar's son, on the show about a year ago, and he was telling the story about how he was at a conference one day and an audience member asked him a question: what's the fastest way to success? And he just blurted out, well, replace bad habits with good habits. And essentially applying these 4 laws is one way to essentially get there. Whether or not that's true or not around the fastest way to success, we'll just leave that out. Good anecdote. That's about it. But, essentially, again, we can just apply the same things to breaking our bad habits as to creating those good ones.
Right. So it's the same process, like good and bad habits are forming in the brain in a similar way, or for similar reasons, which is they are attractive or satisfying and so on. But in order to break them, you need to invert the strategies. And that can be challenging to do. I think generally speaking, the first and the third stage are the best places to intervene for breaking bad habits. Or I should say, like, those are the tip of the spear. That's maybe the first place you should focus. Mm-hmm. So the first law, the inversion of that, is make it invisible. You mentioned this. We talked about it a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Unsubscribing from emails, removing the apps, and so on. And then the second way is increasing friction, making it difficult. And those are the examples like the kitchen safe and locking away the food, or unplugging the TV after each use, or things that increase the number of steps between you and the bad behavior. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say those are good places to start is because they're one-time choices that you can make that make it easier for you to do it, easier for you to resist the bad habit every time after that. Whereas the other two stages, making it unattractive, like reframing the habit in your mind, seeing the downsides of smoking or eating a donut or whatever, it's possible to do, but it's hard because you have to remember to do it every time that you're tempted. Whereas the other ones, you can just do it once and put yourself in a better position to resist.
That makes a lot of sense. So with respect to creating good habits, sometimes they can backfire in some ways. I mean, there are some downsides. For example, I like to get up early and hit the gym at, say, 6 a.m. most mornings. But if I'm out with friends the night before, sometimes that can conflict with, say, my social life in some way. So, I mean, how do we kind of reconcile good habits with good habits in a way, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great question. You kind of don't know your true values until you're forced to choose between them. You know, like then you actually find out what you value more than another, or what the hierarchy is. But the question that you ask is a good one. And I think it hides a deeper truth about habits inside of it, which is that habits often come in bundles. Their behaviors are connected to one another. You know, you go to the bathroom and that reminds you, oh, I need to wash my hands. And that reminds you, I need to dry my hands. And you pick up the towel and that reminds you, oh, the laundry's dirty. I need to throw the laundry in. And that reminds you that we're out of laundry detergent and I need to go to the store, and so on. Right. And so like all these things are connected. And you'll often find that if you're trying to build a good habit or break a bad one, that the problem is often not with the habit itself, but if you walk back the behavioral chain, it's earlier in the process. So, for example, I might say, oh, the problem is that I'm waking up too late. I'm waking up at 9 and I wish I was waking up at 7. Yeah. Okay, well, why am I waking up too late? Well, I'm waking up at 9 because I went to bed at 1 instead of going to bed at 11. Okay, well, why'd you go to bed at 1? Well, usually around 9 or 10, I get a second burst of energy and I think, well, I'll just answer email for a little bit, or I'll just work on this chapter for a little bit. And so the real problem is that I am not good at shutting down and checking email at the end of the day, not that I sleep in late. Right. So the habit to intervene at, or the place to intervene, is not the sleeping in till 9 a.m. or trying to change my sleep habits. Maybe my sleep habits are fine. Maybe the actual place I need to intervene is my email habits, because those are keeping me up late. And so in that sense, I think that line of questioning and realizing that habits often come in bundles and are related can help you identify the actual bottleneck to your challenges, rather than maybe focusing your attention in the wrong area. Yeah. The second thing I wanted to mention there, though, because I think your example is a good one, an important one, which is that, you know, nobody likes to for this truth, to deal with this truth, but life is filled with trade-offs, and we often have to choose between the things that we want to do. And I think, you know, occasionally if you go out and hang out with friends and that means you don't get up early and do your workout, if that's happened every now and then, we could probably make an argument that that's healthy to have a good social relationship. And maybe that's the healthiest thing to do for your body that day, assuming that your workout habits are relatively maintained the rest of the time. It's when it starts impinging, when another behavior starts impinging on something that's important to you again and again, that we start to have to ask ourselves if something needs to change. And one line of questioning that's helped me try to figure out those trade-offs, or wrestle with those better, is what season am I in right now? So I like the idea that life has a different series of seasons. And so for me personally, the season that I'm in right now tends to be more personal focused. I don't have kids yet, so I'm focused mostly on my business and growing that, on my personal health and working out. And if we can imagine like burners on the stove, maybe like work and health are turned up high, but family and friends are maybe turned down low. But then at some point I will have kids, and that'll signal a shift in seasons. And maybe the family burner gets turned up, and maybe something else needs to get turned down. Maybe work gets turned down for that period of time or whatever. And so as the seasons in your life change, the habits that you pursue probably also have to change to match that season. And so that question can kind of help you get toward that. And a similar question I like from Derek Sivers is, what am I optimizing for? You know, like some people optimize for money, some people optimize for time, some people optimize for friendship, some people optimize for family. It could be whatever you want it to be. But if you're clear about what you're optimizing for, then it becomes much easier to figure out what habits you should make a trade-off on and which ones you actually need to pursue.
Yeah. And I think that question around what are you actually optimizing for, like reflecting on what are your values, your deepest, most sincerely held values, and then building a life around that. Because otherwise, if you're trying to build habits that aren't congruent with your values, I imagine it's going to be hard to get those habits to stick.
Right. It's like, can my current habits carry me to my desired future? And if they can't, if your desired future is a person with a certain set of values and your current habits are driving you toward a different one, at some point you're going to come into conflict, right? Like you want those things to be congruent. You want them to be aligned. And if the answer to that question, can my current habits carry me to my desired future, is no, then something needs to shift. But it's only by asking questions like that. What season am I in? What am I optimizing for? Can my current habits carry me to my desired future? Those questions provide clarity around what those values are and what the trade-off should be. And nobody can answer those for you. But I think they're good questions for all of us to have kind of in our tool belt or toolkit and pull them out to revisit occasionally.
Yeah. Yeah. So, James, we have a lot of corporate executives and leaders of startup teams, entrepreneurs and whatnot listening to this show. As leaders, what lessons might they take out of the book insofar as getting the most out of their teams is concerned?
Yeah. So one core concept in Atomic Habits that we haven't touched on too much yet is this idea of identity. And the way that I think about it is that your habits are how you embody a particular identity. So every day that you make your bed, you embody the identity of someone who's clean and organized. Or every time you do one push-up or do a workout, you embody the identity of someone who doesn't miss workouts or someone who's fit. And ultimately, the more that you do these certain habits, the more you build up evidence of a particular identity. So, for example, I like to summarize it by saying every action you take is like a vote for the type of person you want to become. And so the more that you take these actions, the more you build up votes, a pile of evidence for being that kind of person. So no, writing one sentence does not finish the novel, but it does cast a vote for I'm the type of person who is a writer. And no, doing one push-up does not transform your body, but it does cast a vote for I'm the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. And ultimately, once you have enough evidence, you actually genuinely, truly believe that about yourself because you have every reason to believe it. You have proof of being that person. And so if we're going to translate this to a business context for leaders and management and so on, the same thing is true of groups, which we just said is true of individuals, which is that not only do individuals have an identity, every team or group has an identity. And sometimes in a business context, we often refer to this as culture, the culture of a group, the culture of a team. The true culture of any company is not like the slogan that you have on the wall or the exercise you did at the retreat one time. The true culture of any company is the shared habits of that group. If it's not a habit, it's not actually part of your culture. In other words, what I just said, that your habits are how you embody a particular identity, the habits of your team are how you embody a particular culture. And in fact, whatever those habits are, even if they're not aligned with your desired culture, that's what your true culture really is, right? That's what the implied social norms actually drive you toward. That's the way that people actually behave and interact with each other. And so all of the principles that we've talked about related to behavior change and habit formation, they can all be applied to the individuals on your team to help collectively build and reinforce and embody that desired identity, that desired culture for the group. There is, however, one thing that I think leaders in particular can do that is maybe different or powerful in addition to the ideas that we've covered so far, which is you can embody the identity that you want to have. And it's often best done not just like consistently on a daily basis, like be the type of person that embodies the culture that you want, but also through having some kind of powerful story or memo that you send or example to rely upon. So the story that I like that I think encapsulates this well, there's a book called The Outsiders. It's about like some of the top CEOs over the last 100 years. And one of them in there is John Malone, who ran a cable company. And one of his big things that he became known for was cost cutting and being very frugal with the books. Well, early on in his career, he was opening up a very small shop, a very small cable outlet in Buffalo, New York. And one of his first days on the job, they came to him and they said, we need to paint the building. It's due to be renovated. We need to paint it again. And he said, only paint the side of the building that faces the street. And that story kind of, as he over the next 20 or 30 years, like rose up the ranks and eventually became CEO, that story followed him the whole way. Every time they had a budget meeting, every time someone was determining whether they should submit an expense report or not, every time someone was deciding what hotel to stay at or what flight to book, how much do we care about cost cutting? So much that we only paint one side of the building that faces the street. Mm-hmm. And that story became a small like microcosm of the habit and the culture, that the identity that they wanted to embody as a whole. And leaders are in a position where they have the opportunity to do that, to create those kind of examples or stories that can embody the culture and habits that you want everybody else to have. And so I think the combination of use the same principles we talked about to help your employees build behavior change and reinforce your desired identity, embody that identity yourself on a daily basis. So this is focusing on your own behavior change, and then come up with a story, a narrative, an example, something that really encapsulates the core tenets that you want in your culture, and let that spread and proliferate throughout the group. I think those are probably some of your best ways to apply the concepts and atomic habits to whatever team or group that you're working with.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's like the venture capitalist Ben Horowitz likes to say, culture is what you do, not what you say. And the story you gave there of, I believe it was John Malone, is a very relevant one there. So I think we might wrap up on a question around meta habits. Obviously, there's so many different habits people can choose to try and develop. And of course, that comes back to reflecting on what they actually value, what they want to optimize for. But what are some big habit changes that people can make that do deliver a massive return on their lives?
Yeah, there's a sort of these like meta habits, sort of like a class of habits that impact all other habits that you do, like building a good sleep habit. Well, being well rested is going to put you in a better position to perform almost any other habit that you're doing, whether it's productivity or fitness or whatever. So sleep, I would say, is like a meta habit. Reading is another one that I think is definitely true. No matter what habit you're trying to build, you can read a book about it. And so if you build a reading habit, you can solve almost any problem you want. You want to get in the habit of recording podcasts? Great. You can read a book on how to build a podcast. You want to learn how to cook meals? Great. You can read tons of books on knife skills and cooking and recipes and all kinds of stuff. Want to learn how to work out or swim or yoga and meditate, whatever it is, like there's books on all of it. And so building a reading habit allows you to unlock all these other habits. So sleep and reading, I think, are some big ones. You can make a good argument that exercise or some most physical fitness habits kind of have this ripple effect where they impact other things. There's a group of habits, a different way to refer to these. Sometimes they're called keystone habits. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, what is the habit that sort of is the keystone in your day that like maybe pulls the rest of your life in line? And you do hear a lot of people say that exercise is a common one. Some of the other ones that come up are, especially for creatives, going for a daily walk outside. If they go for a walk for 10 or 15 minutes, that kind of gets their creative energy flowing. The day's much better. Meditation is a very common one that you hear a lot of CEOs or managers bring up. If I get my 10 minutes of meditation in, I handle the problems of the day better. And then an interesting one that I wasn't expecting when I was researching the book is like budgeting and finance. A lot of people, if they pay off debt or get their finances in order, they start to work out too, or it ripples into other areas of their life. So those keystone habits and meta habits maybe aren't exactly the same thing, but they kind of have this similar effect, which is you can just focus on this one thing and trust that it will have positive effects in many other areas of your life as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, James. I've really enjoyed this conversation. If people want to learn more about you and your work, they can head over to jamesclear.com. They can find you on Twitter at jamesclear, and of course, pick up a copy of your book, which has sold well over 1 million copies and has been translated into numerous languages, although I'm still waiting for Macedonian, as I said via email the other day, on Amazon and wherever good books are sold. Is there anything else you'd like to share, James, before we wrap up?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And Macedonian is coming in 2020, so
Fantastic.
I'll have one ready for you.
Looking forward to it. Cheers, James.
Thank you.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Gliveski and on Instagram at TheSteveGliveski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.